Imagine a world where a helpless baby is left abandoned on a lonely, deserted road, surrounded only by silence and darkness. The cold night air whispers through the trees, and there is no one in sight, no sound except for the occasional rustling of leaves. The baby, vulnerable and alone, starts to cry, desperate for warmth, for comfort, for something to break the crushing loneliness that surrounds it. But then, something unexpected happens, something that no one could have predicted. Out of the stillness, a figure emerges. A dog, usually seen as a loyal companion to humans, stirs from the shadows. At first glance, it might seem like just another stray, wandering the streets in search of food or shelter. But this is not just any dog. This dog sees the abandoned baby, hears its cries, and in that moment, something incredible shifts. This dog, alone in the world just like the baby, knows it cannot ignore the sound of a human's distress. What happens next will shock you. This dog, with nothing but its instincts and a deep sense of empathy, steps forward, determined to protect the baby in a way that no one could have expected. It's a story of survival, courage, and compassion that goes far beyond what we think we know about animals. But the real question is, why did the dog do it? What drove this creature to step in where humans had failed? Was it pure instinct, or was there something deeper, something more mysterious at play? And what would happen when the world discovered what this dog had done? The answers to these questions may surprise you. As the night wears on, the dog's actions continue to unfold. With every passing second, the baby's cries grow softer as the dog presses closer, offering warmth and protection. But the real journey is just beginning. What the dog did next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the bond between humans and animals. The question isn't just whether the dog will save the baby, it's whether the dog will be able to overcome the odds stacked against them both. The road is long, and the night is dark. Will they both survive this unlikely bond? Stay tuned, because what happens next is something you won't believe. The night stretched on, its cool breath pressing against the stillness of the world, while the lone figure of the dog stood protectively beside the abandoned child. The baby, barely able to comprehend the danger of its situation, shivered in the cold air. But the dog, its coat matted from months of wandering, its eyes dull from the harshness of life on the streets, knew exactly what needed to be done. It took a cautious step forward, nudging the tiny form with its nose, a soft but insistent touch, as if to say, "I'm here." The baby's cries had begun to weaken, but still, they echoed into the emptiness, a haunting reminder of what had just happened. Somewhere, miles away, perhaps in a warm home or within the walls of an indifferent city, a mother had made the decision to abandon her baby. The reasons were unknown, but they hardly mattered now. What mattered in this moment was the strange bond forming between the baby and this dog, two souls connected by circumstance and a desperate need for survival. The dog, having lived through its own painful struggles, understood more than one might imagine. For the first time in its life, it was not just another stray, begging for scraps in the alleyways or fighting off the cruel hands of those who didn't care. No, tonight the dog had purpose. It wasn't sure why it felt this urgency, this pull to protect the baby. It was as though something deep inside whispered that this was the moment its life had led up to. Perhaps it was the dog's past, its countless encounters with loss, abandonment, and loneliness, that gave it an understanding of what the baby needed. Maybe the dog saw in the baby a reflection of its own soul, lost and abandoned, yearning for care and safety. But what if this bond wasn't just instinct? What if the dog knew more than it was letting on, something that could change everything? As the dog crouched beside the baby, it instinctively moved its body to shield the child from the wind, curling protectively around it. Its breath was warm, but the air was cold, and the baby's skin was still so pale, so vulnerable. In that moment, the dog's instincts sharpened. It needed help. It needed to get this baby to safety somewhere, anywhere, that could offer protection from the dangers of the night. For hours, the dog didn't move, staying by the baby's side as if in a trance. It watched the tiny chest rise and fall, checking every so often to make sure the baby was still breathing. Every slight shift of the baby's tiny hands or feet made the dog's heart race. It wasn't entirely clear if the child would survive through the night, but it didn't matter. The dog wouldn't leave. The dog refused to abandon the baby, just as it had been abandoned. The parallels were almost too much to bear. But it wasn't only the dog that felt the weight of this strange fate. Far away, hidden beneath layers of regret and confusion, the mother who had left her child on the deserted road was also feeling the gravity of her decision. Perhaps, in the moment of abandonment, there had been a flicker of doubt, a hesitation that whispered to her, telling her that this was wrong. But in the end, she had walked away, as if leaving the baby behind was somehow easier than confronting the harsh reality of motherhood, of love, and of responsibility. The reasons for her abandonment were tangled in shadows, shame, fear, confusion, or something even darker. In the darkness of the road, where the baby was left, no one knew her story, no one understood why she had done it. But the baby's cries, now quiet and barely audible, told a different story, a story of helplessness, a story of need. Back in the shelter of the shadows, the dog remained unwavering. With its instincts as its guide, it knew one thing: this child needed to survive. The dog's gaze shifted from the baby to the road, its ears twitching at every rustling sound. The night was still too quiet, too empty. It knew that there could be danger out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But there was no turning back now. At first light, the dog began its slow journey, moving carefully, with the baby nestled gently against its side. The path was rough, the ground uneven, and the air still biting. It was as if the world itself were determined to test them, to see if this fragile, unlikely duo could make it through the ordeal. The dog was exhausted, its energy nearly spent, but it pushed on. The baby had begun to stir, a tiny whimper escaping from its lips. A glimmer of hope sparked in the dog's chest. Perhaps the baby wasn't as fragile as it seemed. Maybe they both had a chance. Hours passed, but the road seemed endless. The dog, worn and weary, couldn't help but wonder if the world would ever be kind. Was it too much to ask for a little bit of safety, a place where they could be left in peace? The thought lingered in its mind as it continued walking, never slowing down, never turning back. There was no time for hesitation. The dog had made a promise, even if that promise was unspoken. It had promised to protect the baby, no matter what. The world around them seemed to stretch out in all directions, fields, trees, and uninhabited spaces that seemed to go on forever. But where were the people? Why was there no one to witness this unlikely rescue? In a world that so often felt indifferent, this journey felt like a test of something far beyond survival. It felt like fate had pushed the dog and the baby together for a reason. What that reason was, the dog couldn't know. It only knew that it couldn't stop. It couldn't fail. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the barren landscape, the dog's strength started to falter. It paused for a moment, panting, its body trembling from exhaustion. The baby, though still too young to understand, seemed to sense the dog's weariness. It made a soft noise, and for a brief moment, the dog locked eyes with the baby, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They were in this together, no matter what came next. But where was help? Where was anyone who could take the baby to safety? The dog's sharp eyes scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of life, any sign that they weren't entirely alone in the world. But the road stretched on, seemingly endless, and there was nothing to be seen but the deepening twilight. At that moment, a sound echoed from somewhere in the distance, a soft rustling, followed by the low rumble of an engine. The dog's head snapped up, its ears pricked. Was it a car? A person? Someone to help? But the engine sound seemed to grow louder and then fade, swallowed by the emptiness. The dog tensed. Had it imagined it? Or was something, or someone, approaching? The baby, still nestled against the dog, seemed oblivious to the tension. But the dog's instincts were sharp, and it wasn't going to take any chances. As the minutes dragged on, the dog's determination only deepened. It couldn't turn back now, not when it was so close to a possible answer, not when they had come so far. The night pressed in around them, and the cold became more biting with every passing minute. The dog had to make a decision: continue on this lonely path, or risk waiting for help that might never come. With the baby clutched tightly, the dog moved forward once again, determined to see this through. But the question remained in the air, unanswered and lingering: would help arrive in time? Would they find safety before it was too late? Or was the road ahead even darker than they realized? The world was still, and the dog and baby continued, unaware of what was truly lurking just beyond the horizon, waiting for its own moment to strike. The tension hung in the air, thick and palpable. The next move would decide everything. As the dog and the baby trudged along, the night seemed to stretch endlessly before them. The road was desolate, the air thick with tension, and the shadows around them felt alive, shifting in ways that made the dog's fur prickle with unease. It could sense something was off, but what? Every instinct it had screamed at it to keep moving, to keep pressing forward, even though its body was beginning to fail under the weight of exhaustion. It was like the very landscape itself was working against them, pushing them to the brink of despair. The baby, still cradled against the dog's side, seemed to sense the rising danger as well. Though too young to fully understand, the baby's whimpers had become more frequent, its small hands reaching out, as if grasping for something to anchor it to this world, something to keep it safe. The dog nudged the baby gently, its warm breath the only comfort the child had ever known. The dog's heart thudded in its chest, its mind racing with possibilities. What if they didn't make it? What if they were too late? The dog's mind was clouded with the weight of those unanswered questions as it struggled to find any sign of life along the road. The distant hum of a car, the sound it had heard earlier, still echoed in its memory. Had it been real? Had help been so close, only to slip away? It could feel a sense of urgency growing within it, a tightening knot in its chest that grew with every passing moment. The world was silent, as if holding its breath. Then, through the trees at the edge of the road, the faintest flicker of movement caught the dog's eye. The dog froze, its muscles tensing, and its body went still as it locked its gaze on the shape. It was too far away to see clearly, but it was definitely something or someone moving. The dog's heart raced. Was it a person? A car? Could this be the help they had been waiting for? Or was it something more dangerous, something lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike? The dog's eyes narrowed, its body poised, ready to act. The baby, seemingly aware of the tension in the air, let out a soft whimper, its tiny hands searching for the dog's fur as if to seek reassurance. The dog could feel the baby's desperation, and it knew it couldn't afford to fail. It took a step forward, keeping its gaze fixed on the approaching figure, unsure of its intentions. The silence between them stretched on, thick and unyielding. As the figure drew closer, the dog's hackles rose. It could now make out the shape more clearly, a figure walking along the edge of the road, coming toward them slowly but steadily. Was it a traveler, a good Samaritan who would offer help? Or was it someone who meant harm? The dog's instincts told it to be wary, but it also knew that it couldn't afford to be alone on this road much longer. Its body trembled with a mixture of fear and resolve. The moment of truth was fast approaching. The figure seemed to notice the dog's wary stance. It stopped in its tracks, as though sensing the unease in the air. The dog's eyes never left the figure, and for a long moment either of them moved. The world around them was frozen, suspended in that one tense moment. What would happen next? Would the figure approach them with kindness, or would it bring danger to their doorstep? A harsh voice broke the silence, cutting through the stillness like a knife. "What are you doing here?" The figure's words were sharp, filled with suspicion. The dog's ears flattened against its head, its body tense as it shifted slightly, protecting the baby from view. It wasn't sure what to make of the situation. This didn't feel like help. There was something cold about the voice, something that didn't sit right with the dog's instincts. The hair on the back of its neck stood up as a chill ran down its spine. "I'm just passing through," the figure continued, stepping closer now. The dog's eyes narrowed even further, its body ready to spring into action if necessary. Every part of the dog's being told it to move, to find a way out, but it couldn't. The baby was depending on it. The dog had already promised to protect this child with everything it had. There was no going back now. Another step forward. The figure was too close now. The dog's heart raced faster than it ever had before. Every muscle in its body was coiled, ready to react. It didn't know what the figure wanted or what its intentions were, but it wasn't willing to take any chances. As the figure drew nearer, the dog let out a low growl, a warning that made the stranger pause. For a brief moment, the figure stood frozen, staring at the dog, and then, just as suddenly, it turned on its heel and started to walk away. The dog's growl turned into a bark, sharp and full of warning, but the figure didn't stop. It walked away into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. The dog stood there, its heart still racing, its body trembling with adrenaline. What had just happened? The encounter was brief, but it had been enough to make the dog question everything. Who was that person? Why had they been there, and what did they want? The road was empty once again, but the tension remained in the air. The dog felt a strange unease settle over it, as if the encounter wasn't just a random meeting, but something more significant. Could it be that the figure was connected to the baby's abandonment? Had they been watching, waiting for the right moment? The questions were endless, but there was no time to answer them. The dog's instincts were still telling it to move, to find a way out of the darkness, but it couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was watching them from the shadows. The dog turned back to the baby, its heart still pounding in its chest. The baby was no longer crying, but the soft whimpers and gasps for breath had returned. The dog nuzzled the baby gently, offering its warmth, its protection, but deep down, the dog knew they weren't safe yet. The world was still a vast, empty place, and no matter how hard the dog tried, it couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that something or someone was waiting just out of sight. What had that encounter meant? Was it a warning? Or had they just narrowly escaped something far worse? The dog couldn't let its guard down, not yet. There was too much at stake. As the minutes passed, the dog continued down the road, the baby nestled safely against it. The world had fallen silent again, but the silence was deafening. The air was thick with anticipation, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Something was coming. Something big. The dog didn't know what it was, but it was certain of one thing: it wouldn't stop until the baby was safe, no matter the cost. And with every step forward, the tension grew, the sense of impending danger heavier with each passing moment. What was out there in the darkness? What would happen next? As the dog and the baby continued down the deserted road, the tension that had filled the air seemed to settle into a haunting silence. Every step forward felt like a countdown, the weight of the night pressing harder on them. The dog's senses were on high alert, ears perked at the slightest sound, eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. Despite the feeling of safety that came with distance from the stranger, the unease lingered in the dog's chest, gnawing at it like a persistent shadow. The baby, still nestled under the dog's warmth, had stopped crying but wasn't fully at ease. Its small body shivered, not from the cold but from the uncertainty of its situation. The dog could feel the baby's anxiety, a mirror of its own fear and confusion. It was as though they were both locked in a moment of limbo, either of them knowing what the next step would bring. And then, the unthinkable happened. The road ahead, which had seemed so long and desolate, suddenly grew narrower, the trees closing in on either side. The dog's eyes narrowed as it noticed something strange in the distance, two figures standing motionless by the side of the road. They were too far to make out at first, but as the dog approached, they became clearer. It was a man and a woman, standing eerily still, their backs turned to the road. The dog froze in its tracks, its instincts screaming that something was wrong. The figures weren't moving, but there was an ominous stillness about them. The dog could feel its pulse quicken, its heart pounding in its chest. Why were they just standing there? Why hadn't they acknowledged the dog's presence, or the baby? There was no sign of life beyond their silhouette. The tension in the air was suffocating, and the dog's protective instincts kicked into overdrive. It slowly moved forward, its ears flattened, its body tense. It kept a close eye on the figures, its every movement careful, deliberate. The baby shifted slightly in its arms, a soft cry escaping, but the dog shushed the child with a gentle nudge, urging it to remain quiet. As they drew closer, the figures remained motionless, not even flinching at the dog's approach. The closer the dog got, the more it felt an unsettling sense of recognition. It couldn't explain it, there was something eerily familiar about them. But how could that be? The dog had never seen them before. Suddenly, the figures turned simultaneously, their faces coming into full view under the dim light of the moon. The dog's hackles immediately rose as it met their eyes. The woman's gaze was cold, calculating, while the man's eyes were filled with an unnerving emptiness. There was something wrong about them, something off about the way they stood, so perfectly still, like they were waiting for something to happen. The dog's instincts screamed that this was not a coincidence. No one would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, just standing on the side of a road in the dead of night. But what did they want? What was their purpose here? The baby squirmed restlessly, unaware of the danger, and the dog fought the growing panic inside its chest. It had to protect the baby. It had to get them out of here, but how? The woman stepped forward, her movements unnervingly graceful, like a predator closing in on its prey. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice low and almost hypnotic. The dog froze, its heart racing as it watched her closely. How could she know? The road had been empty, no one had been around. The man spoke next, his voice flat, void of emotion. "You shouldn't have come this way." There was a strange finality in his tone. As if everything had been predestined, as though they were simply playing their part in some twisted game. The dog took a defensive step forward, positioning itself between the figures and the baby. It growled softly, its teeth bared in warning, but the strangers didn't seem fazed. In fact, they barely acknowledged the dog's presence at all. Their focus remained entirely on the baby. The woman's eyes shifted to the child, her lips curling into an almost imperceptible smile. "The child. It's finally here," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, but the words sent a cold chill down the dog's spine. What did she mean? The child? Was she talking about the baby? The man didn't move, but his eyes never left the dog, as if he was trying to read its every thought, every move. "You've been following the path," he said, his voice now carrying a strange weight, as if he were speaking from some far-off place, "but there's no escape from what's to come." The dog's body was tense, ready to spring into action at the slightest threat, but it didn't know what to make of these people. Who were they? Why were they here? And how did they know so much about the baby? The woman moved again, taking a step closer, and the dog instinctively backed away, protecting the baby at all costs. "You've made a choice," she said, her voice laced with something dark, "but there's no going back now." The words hit the dog like a slap. What choice had it made? What was she talking about? The dog didn't know what she meant, but the fear in her words was undeniable. It could feel the weight of whatever was happening, of whatever was unfolding here, pressing down on it. This wasn't just a coincidence. The road, the strangers, the baby, there was something more at play here, something beyond their control. The man stepped forward now, his face shadowed in the dim light. You don't understand, he said quietly. This was never about you. It was always about the child. And you've brought it to us. The dog's fur stood on end. The child? What was he talking about? The dog's heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out on its fur. What had it gotten itself into? Before the dog could react, the woman reached out, her hand brushing lightly against the baby. The touch was soft, but the air seemed to crackle with an unsettling energy. The baby didn't react, but the dog could feel its instincts telling it that something wasn't right. Something was about to change, and it wasn't sure if it was ready to face whatever came next. Suddenly, a loud, jarring sound echoed through the trees, something like a distant crash or a heavy thud. The dog snapped its head toward the noise, its senses on high alert. The strangers, however, didn't flinch. They seemed to expect it. The dog growled low in its throat, every fiber of its being telling it to run, to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The figures before it were too close now. The stakes had escalated in a way the dog hadn't anticipated, and the looming question now was, would they both survive this night? Would the dog be able to protect the baby from whatever dark forces were waiting? The tension in the air was unbearable, and the dog couldn't shake the growing feeling that the worst was yet to come. And somewhere, far off in the distance, the sound of something or someone was drawing closer. Something that would change everything. The tension that had gripped the road, suffocating every inch of space, suddenly reached its breaking point. The dog stood rigid, its fur bristling with unease, but it couldn't move. The strangers were closing in. There was no escape. The baby was still nestled in its arms, a fragile, helpless presence, unaware of the peril surrounding it. Every instinct in the dog's body screamed to protect the child, to fight, to run, anything to escape the encroaching danger. But there was no way out. The woman's eyes gleamed with a strange, unearthly knowing, while the man stood silently, like a sentry, his gaze locked on the dog, unblinking, as if he were reading its every thought. As the woman's hand hovered closer to the baby, the air itself seemed to thicken with dark energy. The dog's breath quickened, its muscles coiled for action, but it didn't know what to do. The woman whispered words that felt like a chant, a language the dog couldn't understand, but they held power. The very ground beneath them seemed to tremble, the trees swaying as if responding to her call. In that moment, the world seemed to freeze. The dog's eyes darted around, looking for any sign of a way out, but there was nothing. Only the two figures standing before them, their cold presence suffocating the last remnants of hope. The baby's faint cries echoed in the stillness, pulling the dog's focus back to what mattered most. And then, without warning, the distant sound grew louder, a deep rumbling, like thunder in the distance, growing steadily closer. At first, the dog thought it was just its racing heartbeat, but the noise became undeniable. Something was coming, and it was drawing near with terrifying speed. The figure seemed to sense it too. The woman's expression flickered, her eyes narrowing, her lips tightening as if trying to suppress an unexpected emotion. The man's stance shifted slightly, a crack in his icy composure, as if he too recognized the approaching danger. The ground beneath them shook again, stronger this time, and the dog barked sharply, a loud warning, desperate to protect the baby. But in that moment, a flash of movement appeared from the corner of the dog's eye. At first, it was barely noticeable, a shape darting through the trees, too quick to fully comprehend. But it was coming closer, and it was no longer a faint flicker. The dog turned its head, heart racing. A figure emerged from the shadows, a flash of motion, swift and sure. A car? No, it was something else. The figure lunged forward with blinding speed, moving faster than the eye could follow. The man and woman both reacted instinctively, their faces momentarily shifting to shock as they turned toward the new arrival. But it was too late. The figure struck like lightning, moving between them and the dog with a force that sent them stumbling back. In an instant, everything changed. It was another dog, larger, stronger, its body powerful and sleek, its eyes blazing with an intensity that mirrored the urgency of the moment. It was no ordinary animal, there was something fierce and primal about it, as though it had been forged by the earth itself, created for one purpose only, to protect. The woman's eyes widened as she staggered back, her power momentarily disrupted by the sudden appearance of this new force. The man reacted too late, his gaze flicking toward the dog that had arrived just in time to save them. The large dog stood between the strangers and the baby, its teeth bared, a low growl emanating from its throat. The air crackled with tension as both dogs stood facing off against the man and woman, who now looked unsure of how to proceed. It was as if the world itself had chosen this moment to intervene, throwing them into a battle neither side had expected. The larger dog turned to the dog who had been protecting the baby, its eyes flickering with recognition, a silent understanding passing between them. For a brief, fleeting second, they seemed to communicate with a shared sense of urgency and unspoken bond, forged in the heat of this moment. Together, they could stand against whatever forces sought to harm the child. But would it be enough? The woman raised her hand as though to cast some kind of spell, her voice rising in a chant, but before she could finish, the larger dog let out a bone-chilling howl, a primal sound that echoed through the trees. The sound was deafening, the air vibrating with its power. It was the howl of a creature who had nothing left to lose, a creature whose purpose was singular, unrelenting. The woman faltered, her spell breaking in an instant as she recoiled, a look of disbelief crossing her face. The man stepped back, his expression now one of fear, something the dog had never seen before in their cold, emotionless faces. In that moment, something inside the dog clicked. The stakes had never been higher, and the fight was no longer just about survival. It was about protecting something pure, something worth saving. It was about keeping the baby safe, no matter what it took. With a sudden burst of energy, the dog lunged forward, its body moving faster than it had ever moved before. The larger dog followed suit, their movements synchronized, a dance of protection and power. The strangers tried to respond, but it was too late. The woman raised her hands in a final, desperate attempt to regain control, but her power seemed to falter, dissipating under the combined strength of the two dogs. The man stepped forward, his face contorted in frustration, but the larger dog turned on him, its powerful jaws snapping dangerously close to his face. He stumbled back, shock and fear evident in his eyes as the two dogs pressed forward. The woman, now visibly shaken, seemed to hesitate, and in that moment, the power she once held over the situation unraveled completely. With one final push, the two dogs drove the strangers back, forcing them to retreat into the shadows from which they had emerged. The woman's eyes, filled with venom and confusion, locked onto the baby for a brief moment before she vanished into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as she had appeared. The road fell silent once again, but the air was no longer heavy with the same oppressive tension. The immediate danger had passed, the strangers gone, but the question lingered: what had just happened? Who were they, and why had they come after the baby? The dog stood motionless, still protectively holding the child, but it could feel a wave of exhaustion beginning to wash over it. The battle had taken everything it had, and it was now time to regroup, to find a place of safety. But just as the dog turned to walk away, a final twist sent a jolt of shock through its body. A soft voice, barely a whisper, drifted through the air, carried on the wind. "It's not over. You've only just begun." The dog froze. It was the woman's voice, but it couldn't be. She was gone. Or was she? A cold chill ran down the dog's spine, the haunting words echoing in its mind. The battle was over for now, but the war had only just begun. And whatever danger had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for this moment, wasn't finished yet. The dog shook off the lingering unease and turned its attention back to the baby, its body aching from the fight, but its resolve stronger than ever. One thing was clear: whatever forces were after the child, they weren't going to stop. But neither would the dog. It would protect the baby with everything it had. And so, the journey continued, the road ahead filled with uncertainty. But the dog knew one thing for sure: it would not rest until it had ensured the safety of the child, no matter what came next. The story was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The words of the woman echoed in the dog's ears, sending a ripple of dread through its chest. It's not over. You've only just begun. The chilling warning, carried on the wind, felt like a promise. The air seemed to hum with an electric tension that refused to dissipate. The dog, still clutching the baby protectively, stood frozen in the middle of the deserted road. The distant rustling of the trees and the quiet murmur of the wind were the only sounds, but they now felt ominous, as if the world itself was holding its breath. For a moment, the dog stood still, as if processing the weight of what had just happened. The strangers had vanished, leaving nothing behind but the lingering sense of danger. Yet the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was still there. It was a feeling the dog couldn't shake. The baby, resting in the dog's arms, shifted slightly, its soft breathing the only sound of innocence in the still night. The dog looked down at it, its heart swelling with the need to protect. The child had no idea what had just transpired, no idea that forces far beyond its comprehension had been at play. The dog had done everything it could to keep the baby safe, but something told it that this wasn't the end. Something was waiting in the shadows, biding its time. The dog took a cautious step forward, its eyes scanning the surroundings. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching into the night, but it had no choice but to keep moving. There was no turning back now. The baby was safe for the moment, but the dog knew that it couldn't let its guard down. Not when it had already faced something so inexplicable, something so dark. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, the shadows growing longer with each step. The dog pressed on, keeping the baby close, its instincts alert and ready. It didn't know how much longer it could keep running, but it had no other choice. The strange figures, the chilling voices, they were still out there. The world felt different now, darker, as if the veil between the ordinary and the unknown had been lifted. As the dog walked, a part of it began to process the strange events of the past few hours. Who were those people? What did they want with the baby? And why had the woman said those words, "You've only just begun"? The more the dog thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. There was something about the baby, something important that the dog couldn't yet understand. And until it did, it couldn't rest. It had to protect the child, no matter what. Hours passed, and the road ahead remained as desolate as ever. The silence was maddening, broken only by the soft shuffle of the dog's paws on the gravel and the baby's gentle breathing. It was as though the world had fallen asleep, leaving them alone in the darkness. But the dog wasn't fooled. It knew better than to think that the danger was over. The first light of dawn began to break on the horizon, casting a soft glow over the landscape. The dog paused, allowing the sunlight to warm its fur for a brief moment. It had traveled far through the night, but it couldn't stop yet. There was a part of it that believed if it just kept moving, it could outrun whatever darkness was chasing them. But deep down, it knew that wasn't the truth. The baby's safety didn't lie in running away, it lay in confronting whatever threat loomed ahead. As the dog continued its journey, it eventually came across an old farmhouse. It had been abandoned for years, its paint peeling and its windows shattered, but it was a shelter. It wasn't much, but it would provide them a place to rest, to regroup. The dog approached cautiously, sniffing the air for any sign of danger. When it was sure there was nothing, it nudged open the door with its nose and stepped inside. The inside of the farmhouse was cold and empty. Dust lay thick on the floors, and cobwebs hung from the corners, but it was quiet. It was the quiet the dog had been yearning for. It gently laid the baby down on an old wooden table, covered in tattered cloth. The baby cooed softly, stretching its tiny limbs, oblivious to the world around it. For a moment, the dog stood by the window, staring out at the rolling hills in the distance. The morning sun painted the world in warm colors, but it couldn't shake the feeling of dread that still clung to the air. The woman's words were never far from its mind, a reminder that something was coming. The road ahead, though peaceful for now, was filled with uncertainty. And no matter how much the dog wanted to believe that everything would be fine, it couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the fight wasn't over. The dog circled back to the baby, its instincts telling it to stay close. It lay down beside the child, its body tense, its senses alert. The silence of the farmhouse felt like an uneasy truce, a brief respite before whatever came next. The dog had never been one to trust easily, but it felt an unspoken bond with the child, a need to protect it at all costs. The baby's safety was paramount. And no matter what dangers lay ahead, the dog would face them head on. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. The baby slept soundly, its tiny breaths steady and peaceful. But the dog knew that rest wasn't something it could afford. The threats it had faced before were still out there, somewhere, waiting. And even if they were gone for now, the woman's warning still echoed in the back of its mind. Just as the dog began to nod off, a soft sound broke the stillness, a faint scratching at the door. The dog's head shot up, its ears standing straight. It moved swiftly toward the door, hackles raised. The sound came again, soft and persistent, like someone or something was trying to get in. The dog growled low in its throat, its muscles tensing as it prepared to face whatever was on the other side. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a figure standing in the doorway. The dog's growl deepened, but it stopped when it saw who it was. A man, dressed in a weathered coat, stood on the threshold. His eyes were kind, his face marked with worry, but there was something unmistakable about him, a sense of familiarity, a presence that felt like it had been waiting for this moment. The dog paused, studying him. The man took a step forward, raising a hand in peace. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said gently. "I'm here to help." The dog's instincts were conflicted. The world had shown it so many dangers, so many unknowns, that trust was a luxury it couldn't afford. But there was something about this man, something that felt different. He wasn't like the others. "I know you're scared," the man continued, his voice soothing. "But I've been following your trail for a while. The baby, it's not just any child. There's something special about it. Something that the people you encountered want." The dog's ears perked up. The man knew. He knew about the baby. The pieces were finally starting to come together. The strangers had been after the child for a reason. And whatever that reason was, it was bigger than anything the dog had imagined. "You've been running for a long time," the man said. "But you don't have to anymore. I can protect the baby. I can help you keep it safe." The dog looked at the man, its guard still up, but the words felt like a lifeline. The tension that had gripped its body for so long began to ease, if only slightly. The baby, still sleeping peacefully, had no idea how close it had come to danger, how much had been risked to keep it safe. "Why?" the dog asked, the single word heavy with suspicion. The man smiled gently. "Because I've been watching over this child for a long time. I know what it needs, what it's destined for. And I know the darkness that's been chasing it." The dog's heart raced. This man was part of the puzzle it had been trying to solve, but the final pieces were still out of reach. Whatever this child was, whatever power it held, the dog had no way of knowing. But it did know one thing: it had to trust this man, if only for the sake of the baby. With a final glance at the sleeping child, the dog stepped aside. The man entered the farmhouse, his presence bringing a sense of calm. The baby stirred slightly but remained asleep, unaware of the gravity of the moment. The man knelt down beside the baby and whispered softly, words too quiet for the dog to hear. But whatever he said, the air seemed to shift, as though the world itself acknowledged the weight of the moment. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the dog allowed itself to relax, if only for a moment. It had kept the baby safe, fought to protect it, and now perhaps there was someone who could help. Someone who understood the dangers that still lurked in the shadows. And so, as the sun began to set once more, casting a soft glow over the farmhouse, the dog settled down beside the baby, its body exhausted but its resolve stronger than ever. The journey wasn't over, and the world still held its secrets. But for now, the baby was safe. And that was enough. The road ahead would be difficult, and the enemies that had pursued them were still out there. But the dog no longer had to face the unknown alone. It had found an ally in this stranger, someone who knew more than he was letting on. And together they would face whatever came next, whatever dangers lurked in the shadows. The baby's future, whatever it held, would be fought for. And the dog would be there every step of the way, its loyalty unshakable. The night grew quiet once more. The dog, ever watchful, curled protectively around the child. The story wasn't finished, but the end of one chapter was already in sight.